tell a little bit of that story as well. As I say, I'll touch on the Union of Crowns in 1603 when James succeeded Elizabeth I in England and inherited the four nations as they were of the British Isles at that point. And I'll also focus specifically at the end, I thought this was appropriate given it is Chicago Scots, to focus on the Highlands and the borders and how James brought in a range of policies that marginalised Highland identity and created some of the problems with perceptions of Highland culture that endured until maybe the 20th century. We'll also look at some of the influences and people that shaped James's life. I'll give some assessment of the type of ruler that he was. I'll explain why his ideas of divine right, his idea that he was God's lieutenant on earth, conflicted so much with the Scottish Church's beliefs, even though he himself was a devout Protestant and the members of the Kirk were all devout Protestants. That much they agreed on, but on everything else, they disagreed quite heartily. We'll reflect a little bit on the significance of the Union of 1603 and how that impacted Scottish culture and society. And I'll also look at, in this period, what early modern people understood by Highland and Lowland and how James's interventions began to change that a little bit. Okay, so in part one, I'm going to look at James's reign in Scotland, and in part two, I'll look at the Highland and the Lowland experience that James brought in within his reign. So you may have heard of James, but equally you may have not. James is an early modern monarch. He sat on the throne from 1567 to 1625, and he inherited England in 1603. But when you think of early modern monarchs, it's more likely that you're probably going to think of someone like his distant kinsman, Henry VIII, who was, I think, his great uncle or great uncle, his second cousin, Elizabeth I, and of course his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, all those monarchs had very dramatic lives. They're instantly recognizable from their portraits. This is one of James's more famous portraits. But again, most people wouldn't immediately know who he was when they look at a portrait of him because there hasn't been many films or sort of plays or productions about his life or dramatizations. But I would argue that he had just as dramatic, if not more, of a dramatic life than Henry, Elizabeth, perhaps not Mary, but he certainly achieved more in real terms over his life and had a much longer reign than any of these monarchs. As well as being the first monarch to sit on the throne of all four nations, he was also the sponsor of the King James Version of the Bible, the English translation that was put together by a team of scholars working from the original Old and New Testament sources, and which had a huge impact on the English language globally and its development. And many of the phrases and the style in which they were translated in the King James Version have subconsciously worked their way into everyday language. And they've also, the Bible itself still remains a favorite among many Christian communities. James was also, and despite considerable unpopularity when he did this in England, someone who created a long-lasting peace between England and Spain and ended the decades of war that had emerged under Elizabeth I. And again, that war had almost bankrupted England and had almost consumed her personally. It led to great physical danger for her with the Armada and other assaults and assassination attempts on her life. But James himself wanted to pursue a policy of ecumenical and military peace across Europe. He also tried to apply this policy of toleration and peace to Protestants and Catholics, both nationally and locally within his kingdoms, but also internationally as far as he could. And as I said, he's also a highly literate king, someone who wrote works such as the Basilican Doron and the True Law of Kingship, which looked at what it meant to be a king and the rights and powers that a monarch had. But his first published book was Essays of Apprentice in the Divine Art of Poesy, which came out when he was just 18. And he also wrote a wide range of tracts when he came to England on everything from the duty that was owed by a Catholic to the Pope, which he didn't think was much when they were based in England, through to one of the very first anti-tobacco treatises. And James hated tobacco smoking, which was then a brand new trend with colonial importation of tobacco, which he hated. Now, this portrait of him gives you an idea of what he looked like when he was around 29 years old. You can already see that even at that stage in his life, his eyes are very careworn. He looks quite tired. And again, there's good reason for that. By the time he was 29 in the early 1590s, he had been through a huge range of palace revolutions. He'd had a real political struggle for his throne and indeed for his life at various points. And he'd had to combat a huge range of internal enemies, all while trying to keep his eye on the English succession. So, so I'll talk a little bit about those struggles now as we continue. Let's check. Can everybody hear me okay? I saw somebody just came online there. Was there a problem? Okay. So I want to start. Sorry. Yeah, that's okay. Okay. So I want to start by talking about James's family and his childhood, which was really quite traumatic for him and quite dramatic. James was born in Edinburgh Castle on the 19th June of 1566, and he was the only son of Mary Queen of Scots and her second husband, Henry Stuart Lord Darnley. Now, the reason he was born in the highly militarised Edinburgh Castle rather than Holyrood or Linlithgow Palace is because Mary was worried that James was going to be seized by her husband, Lord Darnley, or by another member of the nobility. And indeed, as soon as he was old enough, a year later, that's exactly what happened. They did seize James and use him as a figurehead to remove Mary from power. But she defended herself against her husband, Lord Darnley, because even though James was born in 1566, and that was just a year into Mary and Darnley's marriage, their marriage had completely fallen apart. Mary had married Darnley because she had with him the strongest claims to the English throne, and she felt this could secure her leverage against Elizabeth and allow her the right of succession for the English throne. But Darnley himself was weak-willed, ambitious, and deeply treacherous, and he constantly tried to undermine Mary and proved wholly unfit to rule by her side. And their relationship broke down in March 1566 when he was the leader in the murder of her Italian favourite and secretary, David Rizzio. By February 1567, their relationship had deteriorated to such a point they were living apart, and Darnley himself was murdered at Kirkafield, just outside Edinburgh, in February 1567. And here in the image, I'm hoping if I close this, you should be able to see it. In the image here on the side of the screen, you can see his naked body lying at the top. This is one of the eyewitness sketches that were done for the English government and sent down to the English archive. And Darnley's lying here naked, blown with the Kirkafield itself blown sky high with the range of gunpowder that had been stacked under it. But Darnley was found outside, again in a state of undress, but without a burn mark on him, and he'd been strangled in the garden, murdered along with one of his servants. In the other side of the screen, just at the top, you can see a crib just above the houses, and that is the young James himself, saying, "Judge and revenge my cause, O Lord," making a prayer to God for vengeance against the killers of his father. And everybody, of course, believed that the chief murderer in this plot was the Earl of Bothwell. Bothwell was romantically linked with Mary Stuart, and of course, he forcibly seized her in April 1567 and forced her to marry him. And it was that action that caused the Scottish government, or the nobles within the Scottish government, to rise up against Mary. And they seized her at Carberry Hill in June 1567, and then forced her to abdicate the following month. So the young James, just 13 months old, became the ruler of Scotland, and he was ruled over, or had a series of regents that ruled in his name, beginning in 1567 with his half uncle, the Earl of Murray. Now, James himself spent his childhood firmly locked securely within the castle grounds at Stirling Castle. And again, Stirling's up on a very high volcanic crag. It has a large interior courtyard, and it has a large pleasure garden at the bottom that was the purview of the king alone. So this is where he spent his childhood until 1578, 11 years within that space that's less than a mile across. And he was raised by the Erskines of Mar, who were appointed the royal guardians in early 1567. And his mother figure was Annabella, the Countess of Mar. She had her own children, John the Second Earl, to raise, but she did care for James. He called her Lady Minnie or Lady Mummy. The earliest letter that he wrote is a letter that he wrote to her aged 5, asking her to send him more fruit when she was able to. And it's quite a haughty letter, but you can tell that he does care for her. And by all accounts, they had quite a contented life together. And James himself was also taught in the palace by George Buchanan, and had a range of childhood friends and people around him who I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. By contrast, James had a deeply fractured relationship with his mother, Mary, and after she was seized by Bothwell in April 1567, he never saw her again. She fled, of course, to England in 1568, where she entered English captivity under Elizabeth, and she was eventually tried and executed for treason against the English crown in 1587 with the Babington Plot. And James and his mother would not be allowed to correspond until he became a young adult in 1578. And even then, as we'll see, they had a very difficult relationship. James himself also survived 6 palace coups between 1567 and 1585, the worst of which was when he was held prisoner for 10 months by the Ruthven Raiders, named for their ringleader, William Ruthven, the Earl of Gowrie, who seized James because they didn't like his French and Catholic favourite, Esme Stuart, the Duke of Lennox. And Lennox had come to Scotland in 1579. He'd advanced rapidly in the favour of James, and he had become such a power at court that the pro-English, pro-Protestant faction at court wanted him out of the way. He was also a big spender, and the treasurer, Ruthven, was personally liable for that money. So he wanted to take control of James again to stop him spending so much and to ensure that he wasn't in debt. And James himself eventually managed to negotiate his own escape from the Ruthven Raiders by fleeing from them while he was out hunting at Falkland Palace. And then he enacted a swift and aggressive program of revenge against the Raiders. And that was just one of the many palace revolutions that took place against him in this period that he was able to survive and navigate successfully. So James himself, as I said, grew up in Stirling Castle. Here we have a nice picture of him aged 5 with a sparrowhawk. As you can see, he's quite a sickly looking child. He's quite pale. But we see him here with this little sparrowhawk on his wrist. And that gives us a clue as to one of his big passions in life and one of his big courtly pursuits, hunting. So he really loved hunting. And as soon as he was able to leave Stirling Castle in 1578, the first thing he did was go on a hunt outside the grounds. And every summer he would spend up to 6 months of the year either at Falkland Palace or somewhere else, either in the Highlands or in the woods around Edinburgh and its environs. Sometimes he would even go out in the dead of winter, as he did in February at a freezing cold Holyrood Palace, to hunt in the local grounds. And in the bottom of the screen there, what you can see is a hunting glove that James would have used. That would have been used for perching the falcons on the wrist, which is in part of the Glasgow Life collections in Glasgow itself. And again, they also have a range of hawking tools in the collection, including the little bells and hoods that the hawks would have worn. James was also, as I say, someone who wrote a great deal, and the very first phase of his literary career was spent writing poetry. The Essays of Apprentice included a range of works that he himself wrote and translations by French and Italian poets. And it also, incredibly, included a manual on how Scottish poetry should be written, the type of measures and meters that it should have, the type of rhymes it should use, the type of scenes and ideas it should evoke. And it was a very impressive and technical book for someone who had just turned 18 when this book was published. And he went on to publish another major collection of poetry when he had just become married, His Majesty's Poetical Exercises at Vacant Hours. James was tutored by George Buchanan, who, as some of you might know, was one of the leading Latin poets, writers, and humanists of the 16th century. His translation of the Old Testament Psalms, the Psalm paraphrases as they were known, were translated and retranslated multiple times across Europe. And even until the end of last century, Buchanan was so famous in Scotland that they had erected a giant obelisk to him at the village of Killearn in his birthplace just outside Stirling. With people now unable to read Latin as well as they could in the past, his star has greatly fallen. But until the beginning of the 20th century, he would have been as well known as Robert Burns. And again, there were huge debates about whether he or other Latin poets were the best that Scotland ever produced. But his influence on James was profound. He was quite brutal to the young king, used corporal discipline against him, which many people in the court thought was going too far. Railed against James, telling him that his mother was worthless and that she was a harlot who deserved to be removed from the throne, and also that all kings and queens were subject to their people, not the other way around. And he actually wrote a manual to this effect, the De Jure Regni Apud Scotus, on the law of kingship among the Scots, which he gave as a gift to James in 1579, but which he probably wrote around the time of Mary's deposition in 1567. And in that book, he says that any monarch who commits a crime against their people or who acts as a tyrant can be restrained, can be punished, and could even be killed or assassinated by a member of the public for the common good. James would deeply react against these ideas and rebel against them in his own political writings, which included his treatise on witchcraft, the Demonology, published in 1597, his True Law of Free Monarchies, which set out the biblical and natural laws, which stated, he thought, the divine right of kings and showed how they were set up as God's lieutenant on earth, and that the people could not get rid of their king even if they wanted to. And the advice manual that he wrote for his eldest son, Prince Henry, the Basilican Doron, or the King's Gift, where he goes through a range of topics, including how a king should observe the biblical commandments, what they should eat, what they should wear, the type of wife they should look for, and how they should treat each of the estates, the political estates in Scotland. One legacy that Buchanan did give him, however, was ensuring that James was raised as a Calvinist and as a Presbyterian. And although James would negotiate with Catholic France and Spain and try to have further discussions with the papacy when he moved to England, he was a devout Protestant, and that would stay a part of his intellectual world for his entire life. So, after surviving all the various palace revolutions of his childhood, James assumed full power by himself in the early 1580s. He continued to be supported by one of his lieutenants and friends, the Earl of Arran, until the end of 1585. But after that, he really assumed total command in his own name, although with the support of his secretary, John Maitland of Thirlestone. On his 21st birthday, he and Maitland put together a brand new legislative agenda for Scotland in a huge parliament, one of the largest that had ever happened to that date. And in it, he brought in a whole new range of legal measures that set out the blueprint for his government and began to develop and modernise Scotland in ways that hadn't been achieved before. One of the first things he attempted to tackle was blood feud, kin-based violence between different family groups in Scotland, which occurred both in the Lowlands and in the Highlands. And again, the violence that was undertaken by these families was then privately settled in a process known as assignment, usually with judges from each of the families or from a neighbouring family. James cracked down on this and made it illegal for anybody but the king to arbitrate blood feud. And he also started to make it so that the legal structures of blood feud were harder to follow, and started to make the central court the bigger focus for things like vengeance and justice. So in other words, if you wanted to settle a grievance with a noble neighbour, come to the central court to do it, and we'll settle it by law, not by physical violence. He also organised a love feast of the nobles in 1587, where all the members who attended Parliament were to be brought together in unity and reconciliation to settle any grievances they had and to give their obedience and service to the adult monarch. From 1587 onwards, James also began to introduce a central taxation. This was used initially for things like his wedding, which took place in 1589, but also for military musters and for developing a standing army. This wouldn't take place fully for another century or so, but it started that process. And taxation, although it had been very irregular before that point, and usually for specific issues, started to become more of a standing item. James also, in quite a dark episode in Scottish history, was responsible for initiating a series of witch panics that would lead to the persecution of thousands of witches, usually vulnerable women, between 1597 and 1706. He did this because on returning from Denmark, Norway with his bride Anna of Denmark in 1590, he believed that a coven of witches at North Berwick had enchanted the seas to create a storm against them. Initially, he was skeptical about this, but then one of the witches that he tried on his return confessed before him and said that and gave him some testimony that suggested that she had been able to hear what he said to his bride on their wedding night. And this led James to write his demonology, but also to lay out ways to identify witches, including looking for witches' marks, seeing how they fared in water, and looking for other examples of where covens might meet. And as I say, that led to thousands being tried and executed in local communities until 1706, but the last witch trial did not take place until 1727. James also had to put up with a series of factional conflicts in his adult life. He'd fought amongst various factions in his childhood, but this didn't change that much as he got older. Although the difference in his adult conflicts was that they didn't try to seize him personally as much as they had. He had to put down a border uprising by the Catholic Lord John Maxwell in Dumfries and surrounding areas in 1587 and 1588. He had a long-running battle with his cousin and kinsman, Francis Hepburn, the 5th Earl of Bothwell, and they played cat and mouse with each other throughout the early 1590s, with Bothwell besieging James at Falkland and at Holyrood castles and getting personal entry into his suite, only to then drop to his knee and put his sword in service before the king and to seek his mercy. And that went on until Bothwell was driven out of the country in 1595. And the final factional conflict that James had was with the Earls of Gowrie, John Earl of Gowrie and his brother Alexander, whose father was William Ruthven, the Earl of Gowrie, who James had executed after the Ruthven raid. And James, we still don't know the full details of what happened here, and they never will be known, we don't think. But he attended their house just outside Perth in 1600. Alexander apparently tried to seize James, and the two brothers were killed. But later stories suggested that James himself may have set the event up to have the brothers murdered. For what reason, we don't know. And it's one of the great detective stories of Scottish history that I'm afraid we don't have the evidence to answer, at least not just now. James did have a strong foreign policy as well, though many historians have suggested that his policy was really just about ensuring the English succession. He was by far, with the exception of his cousin Arabella Stuart, the strongest lineal claimant after Elizabeth I to the English throne. And in 1586, he was able to agree an Anglo-Scottish league with Elizabeth that tacitly recognised his succession. And when he got this, he immediately cut off a discussion that he'd been having with his mother over the past 5 years about securing her release from captivity and bringing her home to Scotland, and allowing her to rule jointly with him in a plot known as the Association, in exchange for her recognising him with the crown heads of Europe as the joint ruler of Scotland. And when he broke this off with his mother, she was absolutely devastated and heartbroken. She couldn't believe that he did this. But it shows you just how much he was interested in the English succession. He also got a financial settlement from Elizabeth every year, or more or less every year, in his adult reign. He called it a pension or a gift, and Elizabeth called it a gratuity. So on one side, James felt this was a financial gift recognising his status, and for Elizabeth, it was really just she felt it was a trifle that could be used to control him. But the fund went up and down depending on what was happening. So, for example, there was no money paid in the year that Mary was executed, because that would have looked like blood money. but it was increased in the year of James's marriage to Anna of Denmark. And Anna herself was a major part of James's life in Scotland and indeed in England. But James also looked at Catherine of Navarre, who was much older than him. She was 30 when they were considering getting married, and he was just in his mid-20s. So again, that would have been a very different trajectory and led to a closer alliance with France. But the alliance with Denmark was also very important strategically. It united two Protestant countries in marriage, and it produced a series of heirs for the Scottish and English throne, as we'll see. But James wasn't averse to using other Catholic monarchs secretly, usually, as leverage. And he sent secret missions using the double agent Patrick Master of Grey to Henry III in France, and also George Gordon, the Earl of Huntly, to Philip II in Spain. And the relationship with the Earl of Huntly in particular was quite difficult because James was very personally close to Huntly. And then when Huntly was caught receiving letters and plotting with the Spanish king in 1589, James was put into a very difficult position where he had to try and defend his friend, but also had to acknowledge with the church that this was someone that was being Catholic, and that couldn't be tolerated. Speaking of the church, the big debate that marked James's reign was, of course, the battle that he had with the Presbyterian Church. And the Reformation in Scotland took place in 1560 after a 2-year rebellion. It took place while Mary, Queen of Scots, was still on the throne in France with her first husband, Francis I. It was a Protestant revolution that effectively rejected a Catholic settlement completely in the Parliament and did so illegally without the consent of the monarch. And the church in Scotland developed in the 1560s and 1570s without an adult monarch controlling it. So by the time that James became an adult, it was really quite set in its ways and unwilling to listen to him. And he had a lot of work to do to try and bring it under his control. And the biggest issue he had was Andrew Melville, the leading church reformer in that period, and the radical Presbyterian wing that he controlled, known as the Melvillians. Now, that group of the church saw, with the two kingdoms theory, the belief that the crown and the church were two separate kingdoms, and the king controlled the civil kingdom or the civil sphere, but the church controlled the spiritual sphere, and they had the right to correct and chastise the monarch, and to decide all ecclesiastical affairs. And that really didn't sit well with James, who believed in Erastianism and divine right monarchy, where the king was appointed as God's lieutenant on earth and was the head of the church and could also decide on the structure of the church at will. And James's favoured type of government for the church was a top-down structure rather than the bottom-up one that the Presbyterians wanted, where bishops and archbishops would put James's edicts into reality in the church. And over a very messy series of conflicts between 1581 and 1596, James went back and forth with the church at points such as in 1581 and 1592, allowing the legal basis of presbyteries, so allowing presbyteries to be set up and then allowing them to meet when they wanted, but then at other times savagely repressing them, as he did with the Black Act in 1584, which he brought in because Melville and others were slandering him from the pulpit, and he'd had enough of their sedition against his authority, as he saw it. James assumed near complete control of the church after the Tolbooth riot in 1596, when he was besieged in central Edinburgh by a mob of local Edinburgh parishioners who were angry at James banning their minister from the town for speaking ill of him in the pulpit. And James used this as an excuse for trying many of the ministers and finally seizing control of the church's National Assembly, the General Assembly. And from then on, he would gradually start to develop increasing control of the church and start to move bishops back into key positions of control. Now, much has been written about James, particularly in recent years, and his sexuality. And many authors have claimed him as an early queer monarch. Some have suggested he was gay, some have suggested he was bisexual. And it's very difficult to to parse this in modern terms, certainly James had many male favourites over his life. His first one was Esme Stuart, the Duke of Lennox, who, as I said, was forced out of Scotland in 1583. And he wrote a long poem called The Phoenix, lamenting Esme's death later that year in 1583, when he died in Paris in exile after being forcibly removed from the country. But Esme was the only favourite that James had in his Scottish reign, but he had two very high-profile male favourites in England. Robert Carr, the Earl of Somerset, in the late from 1607 through to the early 16 teens, and then towards the end of his life, George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, with whom he was very close, and he very famously said, "I am neither God nor an angel, but a man like any other. Therefore, I act like a man and confess to loving those dear to me more than other men. Christ has his John, and I have my George," as he said. But it's difficult to understand James in this context because he himself wouldn't have had the terminology in this period to create an identity for himself as gay or bisexual. And he certainly said within his writings that alternate sexualities or sex outside marriage were crimes as great as willful murder or incest or witchcraft. So he was quite clear that publicly that kind of sexuality was very, very taboo and something that he absolutely would not support and would even be willing to punish by death. He also created a very public image of himself as a father and as a patriarch, both to his own household and to the nation. And he certainly didn't think of himself in terms of sexuality, but more in terms of power and how he controlled and used that power over others. He had a very successful marriage to Anne of Denmark. They produced 7 children, 3 of which survived until adulthood. He used his children to create great propaganda, particularly for his campaign for the English throne. Here we see a mock-up of the baptism of Prince Henry in 1594 and the ship of state that was brought into the Chapel Royal at Stirling. It's covered in lots of sugar fish made out of powdered sugar, like sugar mice. And it also had the pennants of England and Scotland unified on the masts of the ship as well. He also used the image of his family in propaganda across Europe into the 17th century. And here you can see an example of this from the Glasgow University collections, where he presents himself with his royal progeny, including the family of the King of Bohemia, which included his daughter Elizabeth, who had married the King of Bohemia. And it was through that family line that the Hanoverian line would eventually return to England and become the early ancestors of the royal dynasty today. Now, James VI of Scotland became James VI and first of the British Kingdoms in 1603. And again, it's worth reflecting on what happened here and why. How does a Scottish male monarch become the successor to the Tudor dynasty? Well, there are multiple causes that cause this, and we have to look back to James IV, who was on the throne from 1488 to 1513. And James himself was a highly educated Renaissance king. He was deeply successful, created a great court for himself, and was very good at enlarging and controlling the strength that the Stuart court had over all the territories in Scotland, particularly in the Highlands. And he died at the Battle of Flodden against the English army in 1513. But one of his key achievements was to become so important in diplomatic circles that he married the daughter of Henry VII of England, Margaret Tudor, who is pictured here. And she was, of course, the sister of Henry VIII, and she in turn gave birth to James V. And in her second marriage, she became the mother of Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. So both Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, and Mary, Queen of Scots shared the same kind of maternal grandmother line in Margaret Tudor themselves. They could both trace that back, and they were first cousins. That, of course, gave rise to Mary and Darnley, and in turn, that gave rise to James VI. So with the Tudor line dying off with Elizabeth, And James's line not only surviving, but thriving with all his children, and the fact that he was male and Protestant after decades of rule under Elizabeth, that was something that spoke very strongly to an English government who wanted to ensure that their monarch continued and shared their own religious viewpoints and was politically adaptable to their settlement. James's wife Anna also appealed in that sense because she was a Lutheran. Although by the time they returned, they went to England, she'd actually become secretly a Catholic. So many of you may know what happens next. Of course, Elizabeth I died at Richmond on the 24th of March 1603, and immediately a runner was sent up to James, and within 48 hours, he knew that he was now King of England or was going to be anointed. He almost immediately set out plans to leave, but it would be almost 2 months before he would travel through the various counties in England and arrive to be crowned. And in part, he did this because he wanted to stay away from London while they were observing funeral services for Elizabeth. He inherited the throne of England, which included at this stage Ireland and Wales, and of course Scotland too. And that, of course, has had a huge impact on Scottish history and indeed the whole trajectory of Scottish culture and society, and indeed British society and culture. James himself led what was a very imperfect union. He really wanted to create a union where everything would be unified: legal systems, the church, universities, legal citizenship and status. But this would become very, very difficult for him to manage, as we'll see in a moment. But it also meant that James was an absentee monarch. He promised on his departure for England that he would return every 3 years. He didn't return to Scotland until 1617, and then he never returned again. And Charles I wouldn't come back to Scotland until his coronation in 1630. So immediately that created a distant monarch and created unrest in Scotland. James himself, however, had strong personal relationships with the people he left behind in Scotland, at least in the first decade of his rule. And he was able to say famously to the English Parliament, "Why do you dispute my will so much? I can say to Scotland, here I sit and govern with my pen. I can send them a missive and it is done. I write and it is done." And he created within that vacuum, there was created a new core of Scottish identity, formed again around the Protestant Church and the nobility, who were increasingly unhappy at being excluded from wealth and power at the English court. Now, James, as I said, wanted a complete or a perfect union, and he immediately set up a commission to discuss full unification. But by 1607, both the English and Scottish negotiating parties had walked away, and the only concession was given was that anybody born on either side of the border would be a naturalised citizen of both countries. The only thing that James himself was personally able to accomplish were what we might term the surface elements of union. And that included using his royal prerogative, so sending out almost like a presidential executive order, where he could say something and that would be law, but he wouldn't be able to put anything through the parliaments. And he brought in a few key proclamations in this regard. The first was to proclaim himself Emperor of Great Britain. Always nice if you can proclaim yourself an emperor. He also proclaimed that the shipping and the various public institutions of the nation would fly a unified flag. And here you can see just how difficult that was to achieve. Some of you may know about heraldry, but in a heraldic flag, if you're looking at the flag, the top left corner and generally the left side of the flag is the predominant part of the flag. It's the more authoritative part of the flag. So trying to put together a flag that didn't make one member of the union feel less engaged than the other was really difficult. And that's why the two flags, the Psalter and the George Cross, overlay one another to ensure that that wasn't the kind of message that was being given. And it was this early Union flag that was then portrayed on shipping, on the pennant masts of ships that went out into the seas, and again around public and royal institutions. James was also able to create a unified coinage both in England and Scotland. And one of my PhD students is working on this at the moment and has found that, again, there were very close ties between the different mints in Scotland and England in the first decade of James's reign that produced unified coinage, but they gradually started to disagree and fall apart a century after that. Okay. So in the last part of the talk, I want to focus more on James's particular impact on Gaelic Scotland and also on the borders in the Highlands and Islands, and to think about what that did to Scottish identity and perceptions of Highland culture as well. James had a mix of different policies for these areas, but he was also someone who knew these areas had to be controlled if he was going to become the king of a fully unified entire kingdom that's spread into every part of the land. Um, what we're going to look at in this part of the talk is just how far these policies were informed or developed by the Union of the Crowns, or whether they started before them. I would argue that they do start before that. We'll explain why he was so interested in these regions beyond the need to control them as a king of Great Britain. Whether or not you could describe James's Highland policies as a form of state terrorism, as Ted Cowan did in quite an influential article, and whether his desire for unifying the kingdoms came at the expense of Scottish traditional culture and life. So, as I said, James himself identified himself in terms of power and paternalism towards others. He saw himself as the father of his household with unquestioned power and obedience due to him. And he saw himself in the same way as the father of the nation. And he said in the True Law, the father is bound to care for the nourishing, education, and virtuous government of his children. Even so is the king bound to care for all of his subjects. And that included what he saw as civilizing and educating all the different areas of the country. And again, that was something that even at the time was very, very difficult to see as being true. He also had a very strong desire to centralise government in London and to a lesser extent in Edinburgh, particularly after 1603. But he wrote famously in the Basilican Doron that the area between Carlisle and Berwick and Dumfries and Jedburgh on the other side should be the middle shires of his son's kingdom. And the only way to fully control Scotland and England, he argued, was to ensure that these middle shires were brought under control and that communication and transport lines could be made through them. James was also aware, really aware, perhaps more so than any other English monarch because of his own personal experience, that the Highlands were a real destabilising zone in terms of controlling Ireland. And in the 1580s and 90s, Scottish mercenaries had particularly gone from Argyll, Kintyre, and other areas over into the Irish wars. James had already tried in the 1590s to try and curtail that mercenary trade, but it was something that he knew had to stop, and something he was in a position, more than perhaps Elizabeth, to effect. James was also aware that as a cash-strapped king, he had a terrible, terrible relationship with money and was the first Scottish king to be chronically indebted and also to endure a series of technical bankruptcies until he went to England and the coffers there were open to him. He could see that in the Highlands and Islands in particular, particularly in the fertile fishing areas around the Minch Basin in the Hebrides, that there was much to be made from barreling and exporting fish, much to be made from extracting coal and from boiling off seawater for salt all along the coastline, and also for harvesting seaweed for a range of kelp-based products. James himself knew these were areas that could be modernised and improved quite considerably. Now, this turns to broad stereotypical perceptions of Scots, particularly Gaelic Scots in the 16th century, and prejudices that emerged in that period that James himself tapped into and unfortunately helped to perpetuate. Across the 16th century, there had been a cultural gulf widening between the Highlands and Lowlands in a way that there hadn't before, particularly with the retreat of Gaelic closer to the Highland line, although in the 16th century, Gaelic was still spoken in here in Ayrshire, all the way up to Perth and right along the very edge of the line, all the way to Aberdeen. And it was still very popular as a second language in Scotland, in the primary language in the north and the west. But a series of authors wrote histories and pamphlets and literature that created two different stereotypes of the Highlands. One, that they were a pristine sort of Spartan warrior culture that we should emulate, and another that they were uncivilized and barbaric. And of course, both were stereotyped. And John Mayer was an example of an author who felt that the area could be better civilized and brought under control. But Hector Boyce and George Buchanan, in their histories of Scotland, both praised the Highlands as a really strong, self-sufficient culture that should be supported. Now, in the borders, James tried to bring in a range of policies to create a reality of the Middle Shires. And here we see an example of Hermitage Castle. It's a huge military bastion. There's nothing decorative about it. It's a real form of brutalized architecture with a huge drawbridge area at the front. And it's often used in feature films because it's so dramatic. But it was an important site, one of many in the what they call the border marches, the main regions, the Middle East and West marches, where lieutenants were given commissions to set out and hunt down border reivers. James made this more active in the 1580s and 1590s. The Anglo-Scottish League of 1586 created more communication lines between the English and Scottish border commissions, and James himself set up a standing border council in 1590 to deal with these specific issues. And he also savagely put down a range of feuds, including the Johnston and the Armstrong families, who were really quite lawless in the border region. As I said, he put down the rising of John Lord Maxwell, but he also mediated and tried to extinguish the long-running Maxwell and Johnston feud that led to the burning of Dumfries and widespread attacks in the area throughout his adult reign. James also tried to bring in a new network of boroughs of barony, raising towns to a royally special status in exchange for better authority in terms of local judicial control and better rents back to the crown. And he himself, like monarchs before him, certainly back to Mary and beyond, went on progresses around these areas. He didn't feel confident doing this until the 1590s, but he did go around literally hanging thieves and having kind of rough justice in the regions where he would hear a crime and dispense justice, which often left bodies in his wake. Now, James himself saw the Highlands as a separate and uncivilized area, and like his policy for witches, it left a very destructive legacy in the Highlands. He followed his grandfather and great-grandfather, James IV and V, in wanting to militarily control the Highlands. And they had done this by daunting the family who had been the Lords of the Isles, but also militarily circumnavigating the area in ships and creating control. James himself didn't choose to go on a pleasure cruise like this, but he did use a range of kind of scattergun methods of control for the area that included giving commissions of lieutenancy with quite broad-ranging powers to his favourites, such as William Stuart Houston, the Earls of Huntly and Argyll in the north and in the west, and to Ludovic Stuart in the Highland Central region, around sort of where the Cairngorms are now and heading over towards Fort William. He also brought in a range of legislation from 1587 onwards, including making all clan chiefs accountable for any crimes of their tenants in their lands, and so being able to call them to account and fine them and punish them if the tenant couldn't be gotten hold of. And also, as with the borders, setting up Highland councils to deal with specifically Highland issues. He also set up outposts that were supposed to civilise the area, including the town of Fort William, Campbelltown in Inverary, and Stornoway in the Isles. And again, these didn't get set up until further into his adult personal reign post 1603, but the idea was there before he left for England. One of the arguably most pernicious things that he tried to do was to force plantation in the Hebrides. And these areas had been largely left untouched by earlier monarchs. But as News Peconic has suggested, James himself was determined to exploit these areas for their resources and bring them under his authority. And he gave commission to a group of 11 mercenaries, nobles, and adventurers known as the Fife Adventurers to literally go to Lewis and set up a plantation in 1598, including a fort town, and try and seize control from the MacLeods of Lewis. James did this as a kind of flyer to his potential English subjects to see, look what I can do in terms of bringing authority to an outlying region. As I said, to bring in the herring industry under his control. But this was immediately rebuffed, and they tried multiple times over 9 years to try and control the area and eventually had to let it go. Now, it was different to colonisation, which is a process that's used in places like Nova Scotia, where it was more about full subjugation and asset stripping. But for James, plantation was supposed to improve and help control these lands. The idea was that there would be schools set up, that they would remove the Gaelic language, that they would encourage the inhabitants to set down mercenary behaviour and mercenary contract and pick up trade in the fisheries and other ways, and generally bring in English and Protestantism as markers of civilization. But these ideas would stay with James. And again, I know some of you will know this is familiar from the Ulster Scots, but he would also become and remain interested in ideas of colonisation and plantation as he became the King of England and would use these in places like Nova Scotia, in Jamestown, Virginia, and in other areas as well. His policy in the Highlands concluded with the Statutes of Iona, which there had been much debate about. But these were essentially an attack on Gaelic culture. There's been great debate about how far they were supported by the local community, how far they were implemented by the local episcopal hierarchy as well. But the statutes did definitely disempower clan chiefs. They tried to undermine all the landed rights that the clan chiefs had, to limit their ownership, to destroy their military fleet in terms of their galley ships and their weapons. They really tried to minimize the chief's court, both in terms of refusing and limiting the number of military retainers, but also trying to break the very strong tradition of oral bardic culture that was really essential to the Gaelic language. They also tried to socialize the Highlands as well, firstly by limiting alcohol, particularly whiskey production. They also wanted to ensure that at least the firstborn son of every noble family was, or if every middling family was sent to the lowlands to be educated, to try and remove their Gaelic heritage and make sure that when they returned, they would write all business documentation and landed charters in English. And they also ensured in the local areas that English was to be prioritised over the native Gaelic language. And these would, of course, go on to have a long impact on Highland culture over centuries. So James himself is someone who has been well known, not as well known as his other monarchs. And where does he stand after 400 years? Well, he's definitely someone who's seen by historians as an effective monarch. There used to be a strong discrepancy between how he was viewed in Scotland as a canny survivor, someone who took on many opponents in Scotland and defeated them or brought them round to his way of thinking, versus the view of him in England, where he was seen as a weak and to some extent effeminate monarch who brought in peace against the will of his people, and was also someone who was really poor at finance and delegated his authority to favourites. But recently, historians taking a view of both his reigns have seen that actually many of his abilities to conciliate, to know when to make a ruthless strike against an opponent, to develop a really educated court, and to incredibly survive and hold together a union are really quite impressive things. In Scotland, one of the enduring dark areas of his reign is the persecution of witches, but also the kind of wholesale attempts at destruction that he brings in with his border and Highland Island policies. And there's some further reading there on the last slide, should any of you wish to look at it. I think I'm just coming up to time there, Connie, but I hope that's given you an insight into James after 400 years, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Well, bravo. Fascinating, Dr. Reid. Thank you so much. And we would like to open the floor to questions. So if you'll please unmute your microphones and show us turn your cameras back on. Question, answer, comments, and I will start unmuting and turning on cameras as well. Thank you.
I seem to have terrified everybody. Sorry about that.
So I'll jump in. The capture of James by Ruthven. I'd love to know a bit more about that and what brought on you kind of went. There was a lot in the presentation. It's just fabulous, but a lot to cover, a lot of ground to cover. But
Sure.
that's one piece I would love to know more about.
I'd be very happy to talk about that because that is one of my specialist areas, and I've written dedicated chapters on that. So, the Ruthin Raid, as I say, it came about because James is a young monarch. He actually agreed to take adult rule when he was 11 and three quarters at the behest of his kinsmen, the Earls of Argyll and Atholl, and that faction had been immediately removed in a coup by the Earl of Morton, and then James himself then removed Morton and installed the Earl of Lennox as his favourite. James really loved Esme Stuart, but of course he was French and Catholic and someone who spent a huge amount of money. And Ruthven and his supporters, who included the Earl of Mar, the Earl of Angus, and a range of Protestant hardliners, had derived their support from close relationships with England, which had been developed under Morton. And the treasurer, Ruthven himself, had gone from being sort of £10,000 in debt to almost £80,000 in debt as a result of the expenditure that Lennox had made. So for him, there was really a desire to stop that funding. And so he took James hunting with a number of friends in the summer of 1582. They took James back to his castle just outside Perth, barred the door against him and said, "You're going nowhere." And then they immediately rounded up James's closest allies, the Earl of Lennox and the Earl of Arran as well, and said, "Right, Lennox, you need to leave the country." And Lennox was forced to leave. He eventually, after much kind of hiding and evading of the authorities and trying to fight against the appeal, left and went to Paris, where he died 6 months later in the summer of 1583. But James was kept under house arrest first at Stirling and then at Holyrood. He was sent. The Elizabeth sent delegations, and so did the French crown. They said to him, "Are you okay?" He said, "Yes, I am." But he was clearly angry about this, and we find out the year after that while he played along with the Ruthin Raiders and said, "Oh, I understand that what you've done was for the good of the nation, and you felt that Lennox was a corrupting influence," he does, as soon as he escapes, begin to say, "This was treason. It was illegal what you did to me, and I want to attack you." And the way he escapes is by cozying up to the French ambassadors who remain at court in the winter of 1582-3. That splits the Ruthin Raiders. He asks the French ambassadors to give lots of pensions to the raiders, and of course that appeals to Ruthin. Ruthin is able to clear his debt, and then that leads to them saying, "Okay, well, we can relax a bit. The biggest threats, Lennox is dead. We've been able to secure some of our debt. We can, let James have a bit more freedom." And James himself plays along with them to the extent that they say, "Okay, you can go and hunt at Falkland with a small retinue." And James himself escapes on horseback from Falkland Castle, races to Stirling Castle in May 1583, immediately calls a parliament and ousts the Ruthin Raiders from control. They're forced to reside at home, and over the next year, he essentially brings in increasing punishments against them. He says to them, "Either you admit that what you did to me was treason, or I'll forfeit you. You can stay in exile either in the country or in some cases outside of Scotland. And ultimately, in 1584, this is pushed to such a head that the Ruthven Raiders try again to seize James, and that's when James executes William Ruthven, the Earl of Gowrie. So it's a really brutal episode. He's just sort of 17 when he seizes full control and escapes from them. He never forgets the episode. He never forgives a number of the ringleaders that are involved. And it makes him learn, though, that you can never show love to a favourite, and you can never show favour to one person, even if there's someone you really care for, because it makes you politically weak. So it's probably one of the most influential events of his young life. It really sets him up as an adult ruler.
Awesome, thank you.
I'm interested in knowing, at the beginning of your talk, you talked a fair amount about the Presbyterians, but later on they were not mentioned at all. Were they more or less subjugated over the course of his reign, or how did that work?
It's a complex story, which is why I tried to avoid it, because I know I covered a lot of ground. We could have done another 3 hours on the Presbyterians, and you probably would thank me for that. But essentially, modern scholarship recognises that the Presbyterian wing of the church were quite a small and radical group. They had control in Fife and in Edinburgh and a number of urban centres, but across the broader country, the ministry were largely moderate. They were willing to go with royal edicts on episcopacy or on obedience to the monarch, and they did negotiate with James. James himself knew, though, that they did control the National Assembly of the Church, and they were politically very powerful and had very close ties with England. So, as I said, between 1584 and 1603, he kind of negotiated back and forth with them and had a fluctuating relationship. Once he got to England, he was much firmer about saying that the church in Scotland should start to follow more of an Anglican model. He didn't push that too much initially, but what he did say was that in the church in Scotland, bishops will be brought in as moderators of the presbytery. So he created a kind of hybrid model where the ministry were elders within the presbytery, but the bishop would be the kind of chief elder within that group and one of the chief administrators. That worked for about a decade, but of course, as James got older and became more out of touch with the church in Scotland and became more set in his ways in England and saw the Anglican church and saw how deferential it was to him, he wanted more of that style of governance in Scotland. And he brought in a series of articles known as the Articles of Perth in 1618, which tried to make the church in Scotland more like the English one. That generated huge unrest, and it set the scene for a growing split between the Presbyterian Church in Scotland, which began to gain ground without an adult monarch in Scotland, and the Crown, that would ultimately fuel the Civil War that took place in 1637 and the Covenanting Revolution. So it's a whole long trajectory that I could do another talk on the Covenanters if you really wanted. But again, it is something that James is responsible for. He tries to bend them to his will, and that doesn't really work.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Other comments, questions for Professor Reid? Sharon, do you have your hand up? Well, you've overwhelmed everyone, Professor Reid.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, not overwhelmed.
That was not my intended.
presentation.
Thank you. That was not my intended effect. But I'll go with shock and awe. That's fine. Thanks very much.
I think your presentation was very thorough and detailed, and you've answered the vast majority of questions very likely.
I'm amazed I've managed to get through a talk without a question on Mary Queen of Scots. Not that I want to tempt fate, but thank you for that. I get so many questions on Mary. It's nice to get a break from her, so thanks.
Okay, well, going once, going twice. Don't be shy, please. Yeah, there are lots of comments in the chat, Professor. Everyone is so pleased and complimenting you on an excellent presentation.
Very
So,
much, babe. Any of you do
yeah.
have further questions, please
Yeah.
just drop me a line. You can find my contact details on the Glasgow University website. Do get in touch with me that way if you want to know more. If there's anything else I can send you on. Okay.
Actually,
lovely. Well,
as
thank you
as
for this. Sorry?
oh, as one quick question,
Oh, please.
is no, I was gonna say, would the presentation be available to us, because there really was a lot. We covered a lot of ground, and it would be great to be able to go through it at more leisure, I guess.
Yes,
Yeah, I think it's been recorded, hasn't it? Yeah.
Yes, we post all of these as videos on the Chicago Scots YouTube channel.
Yep.
So it's easy to find. You just Google YouTube and type Chicago Scots, and it'll pop right up. And there are lots and lots of videos there. We've had this history forum running for almost 12 years now, and quite a few of them have been posted out there.
Yeah, the YouTube I knew, but the actual presentation could be interesting.
Sure, I'd be happy
Oh.
if you just drop me a line. I'd be happy to send you the slides over. That's no problem.
Oh, fabulous! Thanks.
Anne, do you have a question? Please.
Because I don't know much Scottish history, but I'm come from the Maxwells, and it was fun to hear that name. Any little tidbits you want to share about who they were and what they did?
Sure. So the Maxwells were one of the strongest families in the Dumfries region. And Dumfries, Kyle, Carrick, so the southwest of the country were in some ways as remote and as independent as the Highlands were. And John Lord Maxwell was a real pain in James's side right through the 1580s and 1590s. He held a series of open air Catholic masses in the 1580s in direct opposition to the kind of national edict that said all Catholic services were forbidden. And he also kind of brought a series of revolutions against James, which James himself put down. And Maxwell eventually became a servant of the crown and a kind of border lieutenant. But the Maxwell and Johnstons had a really brutal feud for 30 years, which including burning one of the lairds of Johnston, not in his own house, but forcing him to submit by burning his house down around him. And it was a feud that was only eventually dissolved by James after about 25 years of trying. So they're a really fascinating family, and there's a lot of local history about them in the sort of Dumfriesshire periodicals, which you can find free online on archive.org and other sources.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Sandy Kerr, I thought I saw your hand up, Sandy, one of our governors from the Board of Governors here at the Illinois St. Andrew Society, Chicago Scots. Did you have your hand up, Sandy?
Well, I didn't have a question at the moment, but I guess if I had to form one, it would be the 3 Roman roads going up into Scotland and the roles of Sir Walter Scott and the border clans.
Yikes, that's a bit outside my area of expertise, but I suppose those roads were still the main transport and communication links that were used throughout the period, and it was very, very difficult to deviate from those. It's why, again, by the time that James was on the throne, they were being used for the post, but again, they were highly open to being preyed upon by reavers and people in the kind of borders, including clans like the Armstrongs and the Johnstons. So I'm afraid I can't say much more about that, Sandy. Sorry.
Any other discussion?
No,
Very good.
I know Helen's put in the chat about the Covenanting movement. Yes, I mean, again, they were very, very strong in the Southwest, one of the major enduring areas of the Southwest. In fact, about 10 miles from me, there's a forest just outside Ayr Gorge where they did a lot of the open air preaching. And you can go into the hills sort of 10 miles south from here and find a lot of Covenanting monuments. But again, Fenwick is a place that is associated with both the Covenanting movement, but also probably more associated with the radical weaver movement in the 18th century and the early 19th century as a weaving town. So again, it has a long history of radicalism and standing against the royal government.
Okay, well, I believe that we're getting close to our time being up and the Zoom stopping. So I think I'll go ahead and stop the comments today. Dawn, did you have one last comment? No, you're just applauding, I see. But Professor, we can't thank you enough for being here today. This was very enlightening. And Gus, Dawn, I want to thank everyone for being here today. You all help us by joining every month to keep Scottish culture and history alive here in the States and abroad. And I do hope you'll continue to join every month. We'd love to have you. Our speakers are really quite interesting and very credentialed. Dr. Reid, I will be in touch with you, but thank you so much and want to wish everyone a wonderful weekend. Be safe and see you next month.
Thanks very much,
Thank
Connie.
you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.